The Meridian Combat Academy had been breaking recruits for 3 centuries, which was precisely why combat instructor Vexhai treated each morning like opening night at his personal theater of psychological warfare. His mandibles clicked with satisfaction as he surveyed today's fresh batch of interstellar cannon fodder. 6 Zephyrian scout forms huddled together, their bioluminescent patches dim with anxiety. 2 Kithaeron heavies stood apart, too proud to admit they were terrified. And in the center of the formation, looking remarkably unremarkable, stood the human. Reyna Chen had arrived 3 rotations ago with minimal fanfare and even less documentation. Standard bipedal configuration, average height, unremarkable musculature. The kind of recruit that usually washed out before week 2, assuming they survived Vexhai's introductory lesson in galactic hierarchy. "Attention, larvae," Vexhai's voice resonated through his throat sac with the precise authority of someone who had perfected intimidation into an art form. "Today we discuss the fundamental principle of military excellence, understanding your place in the food chain." The assembled recruits straightened with varying degrees of success. The Zephyrians managed a synchronized wobble that passed for military bearing in their culture. The Kithaerons locked their joints with enough audible clicking to suggest either discipline or joint problems. The human simply stood there, hands loose at her sides, watching Vexhai with the kind of bland attention usually reserved for mildly interesting documentaries. "Combat," Vexhai continued, beginning his ritual circuit around the formation, "is not about strength. It is not about speed. It is not about technology." He paused behind the smaller Zephyrian, letting his shadow engulf the trembling recruit. "Combat is about will, and will, larvae, can be broken." The words had worked their magic on thousands of recruits across dozens of species. Each culture had their own mythology around honor and courage, but fear was universal. Fear, properly applied, could transform the most arrogant aristocrat into a compliant tool of the state. Vexhai had refined his technique over decades. The key was identifying the alpha recruit, the one others looked to for courage, and breaking them publicly. Once the strongest fell, the rest would follow like dominoes in a gravitational cascade, his compound eyes fixed on the human. Perfect. Unremarkable enough that her humiliation would seem effortless, yet clearly the only recruit not actively radiating terror. The others were already glancing at her, seeking reassurance she had no business providing. "You," Vexhai's primary manipulator appendage, shot out toward Reyna like a striking serpent. "Human, step forward." She complied without hesitation, moving with the relaxed gait of someone taking a pleasant stroll. No military precision, no obvious combat stance, no defensive posturing. Just a woman walking across a training deck as if she belonged there. Vexhai felt that familiar tingle of anticipation. This was going to be deliciously easy. "State your name and planet of origin." "Reyna Chen, Earth designation Sol 3. Her voice carried no inflection beyond basic courtesy. Not defiant, not submissive, simply present. "Earth." Vexhai let the word hang in the recycled air like a bad smell. "Single biome world, no significant predator species, no natural disasters of note. Tell me, Chen, what exactly qualifies someone from your remarkably safe little world to train alongside species that evolved in the killing fields of Zephyr or the gravity wells of Kithara?" The expected response was stammering justification, perhaps a desperate appeal to hidden strengths or family honor. What Vexhai got instead was a slight tilt of Reyna's head and a question that somehow managed to sound genuinely curious. "I'm not sure yet. What does qualify someone?" Wrong answer. Completely, catastrophically wrong. The human was supposed to provide ammunition for her own humiliation, not turn the interrogation into a philosophical inquiry. Vexahai's mandibles clicked in irritation. Fine. Time for the direct approach. Perhaps, he said, moving closer until his bulk cast her in shadow. A demonstration of your world's military prowess would enlighten us all. Without warning, his secondary manipulator swept toward her face in a calculated strike designed not to cause permanent damage, but to deliver maximum psychological impact. It was his signature move, the casual backhand that said, your reflexes mean nothing, your dignity means less, and everyone watching will remember that you were too slow to matter. Except her hand was already there. Reyna's fingers wrapped around his wrist with the kind of gentle precision usually associated with handling delicate instruments. Not a desperate grab or a reflexive block, just a calm interception that suggested she had been expecting exactly this move at exactly this moment. For 3 heartbeats, instructor and recruit stood frozen in that impossible tableau. Vexhai's strike halted mid-arc, Reyna's grip neither tight nor loose, just perfectly sufficient. Her expression hadn't changed. If anything, she looked mildly interested in this new development. Huh, she said, examining his captured appendage like she was studying an unusual geological formation. That was faster than I expected. She looked up at him with the kind of smile that belonged on someone who had just solved a particularly engaging puzzle. Next lesson? The training deck had gone silent with the quality of vacuum that suggested even the air recycling systems were holding their breath. The Zephyrians' bioluminescent patches had shifted to colors that probably indicated either religious awe or imminent bowel evacuation. The Kitharans were making the low harmonic hum that served as their species' equivalent of nervous laughter. Vexhai stared down at the human's unremarkable face and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades of breaking recruits. Complete bewilderment. She was still holding his wrist, still smiling, still waiting for whatever came next with the patience of someone who had all day and found the current situation genuinely entertaining. Release me, he managed, his voice carrying considerably less authority than intended. Sure, Reyna opened her fingers, and his arm dropped to his side. Should I step back into formation, or did you want to continue with the demonstration? The question was asked with the same mild courtesy she might use when asking about lunch schedules. No mockery, no triumph, no acknowledgement that she had just done something that should have been impossible. Just a recruit asking her instructor for guidance on the next phase of training. Vexhai found himself nodding before his conscious mind caught up with the gesture. Formation. Yes. Return to formation. As Reyna walked back to her position among the other recruits, Vexhai became aware that his carefully orchestrated demonstration had transformed into something else entirely. The other recruits were no longer looking at him with the proper mixture of fear and respect. They were looking at the human with expressions he couldn't quite interpret. The Zephyrians' patches had shifted to rapid cycling patterns that suggested either intense curiosity or the early stages of hero worship. The Kitharans had stopped their nervous humming and were studying Reyna with the focused attention their species reserved for potential pack leaders. Dismissed, Vexhai announced, his voice echoing strangely in the vast training space. Return to quarters. Training resumes at next cycle. The recruits filed out with considerably more animated conversation than usual. Vexhai remained on the deck, staring at the spot where a human from a safe little world had casually intercepted a strike that had broken the will of recruits from warrior cultures across the galaxy. The most disturbing part wasn't that she had been fast enough to catch him. Speed could be trained, reflexes could be enhanced. The disturbing part was the look in her eyes when she asked about the next lesson, like someone who had just discovered a new hobby and was eager to learn more. Like someone who was enjoying herself. Vexahai's mandibles clicked once in the empty training deck, the sound swallowed by the hum of life support systems. In 3 centuries of breaking recruits, he had learned to recognize every possible response to his methods. Fear, anger, despair, defiance, all predictable, all manageable. But this serene curiosity in the face of calculated humiliation? This was something new. Wing Commander Threxna had been monitoring Academy communications for 47 years, which meant she had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when routine reports contained career-ending disasters disguised as minor incidents. The message from Vexhai's training deck pinged her consciousness with all the subtlety of a collapsing star. Human recruit displayed unexpected reflexes during standard dominance assessment. Recommend enhanced observation protocols. In the language of institutional bureaucracy, that translated roughly to, something happened that I don't understand. It probably violated several regulations, and I'm documenting it, so when everything goes sideways, the blame flows uphill instead of landing on my carapace. Threxna's 4 eyes focused independently on different data streams as she cross-referenced the incident report with Academy psychological profiles. Humans were supposed to be fragile. The preliminary assessments had been unanimous. Single-world species, minimal environmental pressures, sociological patterns suggesting easy psychological manipulation. Perfect candidates for project compliance, except the footage from the training deck told a different story entirely. Computer, replay training deck incident. Focus on Recruit Chen's biometric readings during instructor contact. The holographic display materialized with clinical precision. There was Vexhai, performing his signature humiliation strike with the practiced cruelty of a master craftsman. There was the human, standing with the relaxed posture of someone waiting for a particularly interesting lecture to begin. And there was the moment that had turned routine psychological warfare into something resembling a nature documentary about apex predators playing with their food. The biometric readings were what made Threxna's secondary heart skip a beat. No stress response, no adrenaline spike, no elevated cortisol levels. If anything, the human's neurochemical patterns suggested mild curiosity and something that looked disturbingly like anticipation. Instructor Kalvek, report to command immediately. The Kithaeron arrived within minutes, his heavy frame filling the doorway with the kind of presence that suggested he had evolved on a world where anything smaller than a tank got eaten for breakfast. As the Academy's specialist in breaking warrior cultures, Kalvek had earned his reputation by understanding that every species had a psychological pressure point. You just had to find the right leverage. You've reviewed the Chen incident? Threxna gestured toward the still-active hologram. Interesting reflexes, Kalvek rumbled, his voice carrying the harmonic undertones that meant he was either deeply thoughtful or mildly annoyed. But reflexes can be overcome. Vexhai simply needs to recalibrate his approach. Watch it again. Focus on her face. They studied the replay in silence. Vexhai's strike caught mid-arc, the human's expression of genuine curiosity, that unsettling smile. The question that had somehow transformed a demonstration of power into a request for continuing education. She's treating it like a game, Kalvek observed, his harmonics shifting toward what Threxna recognized as professional intrigue, or like training. Threxna highlighted the biometric data with a gesture. These readings don't match someone who's been humiliated. They match someone who's just been presented with a new learning opportunity. Before Kalvek could respond, the communication system chimed with another priority message, then another. Then 17 more in rapid succession, all originating from different sections of the Academy. Instructor Zeftai from Advanced Combat Systems. Human recruit requested additional sparring partners after standard 2-on-1 exercise proved insufficient challenge. Instructor Velmoth from Psychological Resistance Training. Human subject showed no response to fear inducement protocols, asked if we had harder difficulty settings. Instructor Quindar from survival training. Human completed 72-hour endurance trial in 38 hours, spent remainder of allocated time exploring previously unmapped cave systems. Returned with detailed geological survey and 3 new species of cave-dwelling arthropods she found interesting. Threxna felt the familiar weight of command decisions that could either advance careers or end them. The humans were supposed to be a control group, a baseline species so psychologically fragile that any technique capable of breaking them would work on anyone. Instead, they were systematically treating every escalation of Academy brutality as an upgrade to their entertainment options. Calvek, how quickly can you design a scenario specifically calibrated to human psychology? Standard parameters? The Kitharan's harmonics shifted toward what might have been professional enthusiasm. Fear of death, social isolation, failure to protect others? Try something different. Threxna pulled up the growing file of human anomalies. These readings suggest they don't respond to standard fear-based motivation. What if we approached this from the opposite direction? Meaning, what if instead of trying to break them, we tried to bore them? Calvek's massive form went perfectly still, which in Kitharan body language indicated either deep contemplation or the early stages of an aneurysm. You want to weaponize tedium? I want to understand why a species that should have been psychologically demolished by routine training procedures is instead treating our most advanced psychological warfare techniques like recreational activities. 3 decks below, in the Academy's main training amphitheater, Vexhai was discovering that his problems had multiplied exponentially. The other recruits had not, as expected, been cowed by witnessing Reyna's strange immunity to his authority. Instead, they had begun treating her like some sort of psychological consultant. How did you know he was going to do that? The smaller Zephyrian, designation Fluxway, had cornered Reyna during the rest period, her bioluminescent patches cycling through colors that suggested intense curiosity. I didn't. Reyna was methodically cleaning her gear with the kind of attention to detail that suggested either military discipline or deeply ingrained habit. But he'd been building up to something physical since we formed up. Body language, positioning, vocal patterns. Plus, the whole breaking your will speech seemed like it needed a practical demonstration. But you caught his hand. One of the Kitharans, Havek, according to his designation marker, had joined the impromptu discussion. Our combat instructors move faster than projectile weapons. How does someone from a peaceful world develop reflexes like that? Reyna paused in her cleaning routine, considering the question with the same mild curiosity she'd shown during Vexhai's demonstration. Earth isn't exactly peaceful. We just export our violence efficiently. Meaning, we've had about 12,000 years of recorded warfare, genocide, systematic oppression, slavery, and creative new ways to make each other suffer. If you grow up studying that history, physical intimidation starts feeling like amateur hour. The silence that followed carried the quality of vacuum that suggested several fundamental assumptions about human civilization had just collapsed under the weight of new information. Fluxway's patterns shifted to rapid-fire cascades of color that probably indicated either fascination or the alien equivalent of nervous laughter. You study your own species' atrocities as educational material? History classes, mostly. Philosophy, literature, political science. You can't really understand human achievement without understanding human cruelty. They're not separate phenomena. They're the same phenomenon expressed through different channels. Havek's harmonic hum had dropped to frequencies that suggested deep thoughtfulness. So when Instructor Vexhai attempted to humiliate you, I was curious to see how his technique compared to what humans have already done to each other. Reyna resumed her equipment maintenance. Turns out, not very favorably. He's got good instincts for psychological pressure, but he's working with a limited toolkit. Most human cultures developed more sophisticated methods of breaking people centuries ago. And this knowledge makes you resistant? Makes me educated. She looked up at her fellow recruits with that same unsettling smile that had so thoroughly disrupted Vexhi's demonstration. If you've studied the Rwandan genocide, the Khmer Rouge, and the systematic dehumanization techniques perfected during the Atlantic slave trade, someone trying to hurt your feelings by questioning your planetary origin starts feeling like a gentle critique rather than psychological warfare. The conversation was interrupted by the return of Vexhi, whose mandibles were clicking with the rapid-fire pattern that indicated either intense concentration or an impending nervous breakdown. Attention recruits, training parameters have been modified. Report to Advanced Scenario Deck. 7 for immediate implementation of enhanced psychological resistance protocols. As the group moved towards their new assignment, Threxna observed from her command station that the humans' biometric readings remained stubbornly calm. If anything, they suggested she was looking forward to whatever came next, which, given the Academy's increasingly desperate attempts to find her breaking point, was probably the most terrifying response of all. Director Malx Theo had been running psychological warfare research for the Hegemony's Department of Species Integration for longer than most civilizations had possessed written language. In that time, he had developed what he considered a healthy respect for the universe's capacity to present him with problems that defied conventional solutions. The human problem, however, was beginning to feel less like a research challenge and more like a cosmic joke at his expense. "Show me the Chen files again," he commanded, settling his bulk into the bio-adaptive seating that had been specially configured for his species' physiology. All of them. Start with the recruitment assessment. The holographic displays materialized around him in concentric layers, each one representing a different aspect of what should have been a straightforward xenopsychological study. The innermost layer showed the original target parameters. Identify a species vulnerable to systematic psychological manipulation, develop protocols for their subjugation, then field test those protocols on other problematic populations throughout hegemony space. Earth had seemed perfect. The preliminary surveys indicated a species that had spent most of its evolutionary history finding innovative ways to torment its own members. Surely, Malx Theo had reasoned, a species that had already perfected the art of breaking itself would crumble under professional-grade psychological pressure. The second layer of data told a different story entirely. Computer, compile anomaly reports from the past 72 hours. The list that materialized would have been impressive if it weren't so deeply unsettling. Reyna Chen had not only survived every escalation of the Academy's psychological pressure protocols, she had treated each one as a case study in comparative methodology. Isolation chambers designed to induce claustrophobic panic? She had spent the time working through what appeared to be mental exercises in structural engineering, emerging with detailed plans for improving the facility's architectural efficiency. Sensory deprivation, intended to cause hallucinations and psychological fragmentation. She had used the silence to organize what she described as an internal catalog of every interesting conversation I've ever had, then requested an extended session because she was only about halfway through the good ones. Direct neural interface with fear-inducing imagery calibrated to trigger species universal survival responses. She had provided detailed critiques of the imagery's historical accuracy and suggested several more psychologically effective alternatives based on things humans actually did to each other during the 30 Years' War. "Sir?" His aide, Aivelti, whose species had evolved natural empathic abilities specifically suited to psychological research, entered the chamber with the cautious demeanor of someone bringing news that would probably result in budget cuts or career termination. The human has requested a meeting. Requested? She submitted a formal inquiry through Academy channels, said she wanted to discuss research methodology and potential collaboration opportunities. The aide's empathic tendrils quivered with what Malxtheo recognized as barely contained alarm. "Sir, she knows." The statement hung in the recycled air like a biological weapon waiting to detonate. Of course she knew. The only question was how much, and whether the Academy's carefully constructed cover story would survive contact with whatever passed for human diplomatic protocols. "Send her in." Raina Chen entered the research chamber with the same unhurried gait that had so thoroughly disrupted Vexhi's training demonstration. She moved like someone who had been invited to collaborate on a project she found genuinely interesting, rather than someone who had just discovered she was the subject of what technically qualified as war crimes under 17 different interstellar treaties. Director Malxtheo. She settled into the offered seating with practiced ease. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I have some questions about your research parameters, and I thought it might be more efficient to discuss them directly rather than continuing to communicate through training scenarios." The casual acknowledgement that she had been treating the Academy's psychological warfare protocols as a form of academic correspondence was somehow more unsettling than outright accusation would have been. "What questions?" Malxtheo kept his voice neutral, falling back on decades of experience in managing conversations that could either advance scientific knowledge or trigger diplomatic incidents. "Well, first, I'm curious about your baseline assumptions regarding human psychological resilience." Raina leaned forward slightly, her posture suggesting intellectual engagement rather than confrontation. "Your testing protocols seem calibrated for a species that breaks under pressure, but humans don't really work that way. We're more like adaptive learning systems. Each attempt to break us just provides data for handling the next attempt." "And this troubles you?" "Troubles? No." That unsettling smile again. "It fascinates me. See, I think you've been approaching this backwards. You've been trying to find ways to break humans so you can apply those techniques to other species. But what if the interesting question is not how to break us, but why we're so difficult to break in the first place?" Malxtheo felt his primary nervous system register what his species recognized as a predator-prey response. "Explain." "Humans are the only species I'm aware of that spent millennia systematically documenting their own capacity for evil." Raina's voice carried the tone of someone explaining a particularly elegant mathematical proof. "We didn't just experience genocide, slavery, and systematic oppression. We studied them. We turned our own worst impulses into academic disciplines. We have entire fields of research dedicated to understanding exactly how and why humans break other humans. This is supposed to be reassuring. It's supposed to be informative." She gestured toward the surrounding displays with their layers of psychological assessment data. "Every technique you've applied to me, some human culture has already perfected and then developed countermeasures for. Isolation. Humans invented solitary confinement and then learned to survive it through mental discipline techniques passed down by political prisoners. Fear conditioning? We mapped the neurology of trauma response and developed therapeutic interventions. Social pressure and humiliation? We've been studying those since we invented anthropology." The implications of what she was describing began to cascade through Malxtheo's awareness, like a computational virus designed to crash logical systems. "You're saying humans are immune to psychological manipulation because you've already experienced every form of psychological manipulation?" "Not immune. Educated." Reyna's expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy if it hadn't been quite so terrifying. The thing is, Director, your research methodology has a fundamental flaw. You're trying to break a species that evolved by surviving its own attempts to break itself. Every technique you develop, we've probably already survived a more sophisticated version of. Then what? Malx Theo asked, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone watching their life's work collapse in real time. Do you suggest? That depends on what you are actually trying to accomplish. Reyna leaned back in her seating, her posture suggesting someone settling in for a longer conversation. If you want to understand how to break other species, studying humans is probably counterproductive. We're outliers. But if you want to understand how to make other species more resilient, more adaptable, more capable of surviving adversity. She let the sentence hang in the air like a diplomatic offering wrapped in intellectual curiosity. Now that, she continued, would be genuinely interesting research. Malx Theo stared at the human who had just systematically deconstructed months of carefully planned psychological warfare and somehow transformed it into a research collaboration proposal. In the silence that followed, he became aware that his fundamental assumptions about the nature of psychological dominance had been quietly rearranged into something resembling their exact opposite. You want to teach other species to be more like humans, he said, testing the concept against his understanding of interstellar power dynamics. I want to help other species develop the same kind of psychological resilience that humans take for granted. Reyna's smile carried genuine warmth for the first time since she had arrived at the Academy. Because honestly, Director, the universe is a hostile place. Wouldn't it be better if everyone was harder to break? The question echoed in the research chamber long after she had departed, leaving Malx Theo alone with the growing realization that Project Compliance had just become something else entirely, something that might actually work. 6 months later, the Meridian Combat Academy had become something that would have been unrecognizable to its original architects, assuming any of them had possessed sufficient imagination to envision their psychological warfare facility transformed into what amounted to an interstellar resilience training center. Instructor Vexhai stood at the edge of Training Deck 7, watching his former recruits demonstrate techniques that defied every principle of military hierarchy he had spent 3 centuries perfecting. The Zephyrian Fluxway was leading a group of newly arrived Kithaeron cadets through what she called perspective reframing exercises, essentially teaching them to treat humiliation attempts as data collection opportunities rather than personal attacks. Remember, Fluxway's bioluminescent patches pulsed in patterns that indicated professional confidence. When someone tries to diminish your worth, they're providing valuable intelligence about their own insecurities and tactical limitations. Thank them for the information, and ask what else they'd like to share. The Kithaerons were practicing this approach on each other with the methodical thoroughness their species brought to all learning experiences. What had once been a simple dominance hierarchy was evolving into something resembling a collaborative research project on the psychology of power dynamics. Vexhai's mandibles clicked in rhythms he couldn't quite identify. Pride? Bewilderment? Professional obsolescence? Perhaps all 3. Unusual sight, isn't it? He turned to find Reyna Chen approaching with the relaxed stride that had become her signature throughout the Academy. She carried herself differently now, not with the casual alertness of someone expecting threats, but with the confident ease of someone who had successfully transformed an entire institutional culture through strategic applications of curiosity and stubborn optimism. They're teaching each other, Vexhai observed, his voice carrying undertones of something that might have been wonder if members of his species were capable of such responses. They're sharing survival strategies. Reyna joined him in observing the training session. Turns out most species have developed some form of psychological resilience. They just never thought to compare notes before. And now they do. Now they do. She gestured toward the far end of the deck, where Havoc was demonstrating Kithaeron harmonic meditation techniques to a mixed group of species, while a Zephyrian instructor shared bioluminescent pattern recognition methods for detecting emotional manipulation. Amazing what happens when you stop treating psychological warfare as a zero-sum competition and start treating it as collaborative problem-solving. The transformation hadn't been immediate. The first few weeks after Reyna's meeting with Director Malx Theo had been chaotic, as Academy leadership grappled with the implications of their research methodology achieving the exact opposite of its intended goals. The psychological warfare protocols designed to break difficult populations had instead created the most psychologically resilient interspecies community in recorded galactic history. "The director wants to see you," Vexhai informed her, his tone suggesting the kind of bureaucratic summons that usually preceded either promotion or prosecution. "Probably wants to discuss the expansion proposal." Reyna's expression suggested mild interest rather than concern. 3 more sectors have requested Academy consultation on what they're calling adaptive resilience training. Apparently, species that complete our programs show significantly improved performance under stress. Vexahai processed this information with the growing awareness that the facility he had once ruled through calculated intimidation had become the galaxy's premier destination for learning how to survive adversity with dignity intact. The irony wasn't lost on him, though he suspected it had been completely lost on whoever had originally approved Project Compliance. "Do you miss it?" Reyna asked, her question carrying genuine curiosity. "The old system, where breaking people was the point." The question required consideration. Vexhai had built his career on the principle that psychological dominance was a finite resource, that making others smaller somehow made him larger. The new paradigm suggested something different entirely, that psychological strength was infinitely renewable, and that teaching others to be unbreakable somehow enhanced rather than diminished his own capabilities. "I thought I understood power," he admitted, watching as his former victims cheerfully taught newcomers how to deflect the very techniques he had once used to crush their spirits. "I thought it meant making others afraid." "And now?" "Now I think it might mean making others fearless." Reyna nodded as if this realization was both inevitable and overdue. "That's the thing about humans, instructor. We spent so long learning how to survive each other that we accidentally figured out how to help each other survive everything else." 20 minutes later, Director Malx Theo's office had been reconfigured to accommodate what appeared to be the galaxy's most improbable academic conference. Representatives from 17 different species crowded the space, all seeking consultation on implementing what Academy documentation now officially termed human-derived psychological resilience protocols. "The preliminary results exceed all projections," reported a Veltaran psychologist whose species had spent millennia perfecting social conformity through peer pressure. Populations trained in human methodologies show 73% improved resistance to authoritarian manipulation techniques. Economic productivity in stress-resistance-trained populations has increased by 41%, added a Quixnal administrator whose people had built their civilization on the principle that efficiency required absolute submission to authority. Workers who cannot be broken by traditional management techniques apparently produce higher quality output. Malx Theo reviewed the data streams with the expression of someone who had accidentally discovered that his failure was more successful than his original success had ever been. Project Compliance had indeed created a methodology for controlling problematic populations. It had just done so by making those populations psychologically immune to control. "What's the Academy's position on permanent expansion?" asked the Veltaran representative. Before Malx Theo could respond, Reyna Chen entered the office with the unhurried confidence that had become her trademark throughout the facility. She moved past the assembled delegates and settled into an available seat as if she belonged there, which, given the Academy's transformation, she probably did. "That depends," she said, addressing the question as if it had been directed to her. "On whether you want to learn techniques for controlling people or techniques for helping people become uncontrollable." The silence that followed carried the weight of civilizations reconsidering their fundamental assumptions about power, authority, and the relationship between strength and vulnerability. "Because," Reyna continued, her voice carrying the tone of someone explaining a concept that should have been obvious, "if you want to control people, you probably shouldn't be asking humans for advice. We're not really good at that. But if you want to help people become the kind of individuals who can't be controlled by anyone..." She looked around the room with that same unsettling smile that had started this entire transformation, the expression of someone who had just offered to share the most valuable knowledge her species possessed. "Well," she concluded, "that's something we know quite a bit about." Vex High, observing from his position near the doorway, felt something he had never experienced in 3 centuries of psychological warfare. The satisfaction of watching power distribute itself rather than concentrate. The Academy had become a place where strength multiplied instead of dividing, where teaching others to be unbreakable somehow made everyone more resilient. As the meeting dissolved into enthusiastic planning sessions for interstellar resilience training programs, Vex High approached Reyna with a question that had been developing since their first encounter on the training deck. "The technique you used?" he said, referring to her casual interception of his signature humiliation strike. "Where did you learn it?" "High school." Reyna's answer carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing routine educational experiences. "Basic bullying defense. If someone's trying to hit you to prove a point, catch their hand and ask them to explain the point instead. Usually they haven't thought it through. And if they have, then you learn something new." She stood to leave, pausing to deliver one final observation. "That's the thing about humans, instructor. We don't really have a concept of unanswerable questions, just questions we haven't figured out yet." As she walked away, Vex High found himself alone with the realization that the Academy's transformation was less about humans teaching other species to be resilient, and more about humans demonstrating that resilience was simply what happened when you treated every attempt to break you as education rather than persecution. The most unsettling part wasn't that humans were unbreakable. The most unsettling part was that they had made being unbreakable look like the most natural thing in the universe. He looked around the office, now buzzing with excited conversations about expanding psychological resilience training throughout the galaxy, and felt his mandibles click once in what might have been approval. After all these years, he was finally learning something new. "So," he murmured to the empty space where Reyna had been standing. "Next lesson?" The question echoed in the recycled air, carrying with it the promise of answers he had never thought to seek, and an education that had only just begun.